Um, the journey that I began was at the age of 19 as a conscientious objector in the city of Chicago. And my colleague Bernard Lafayette started at the age of 19 in the city of Nashville. And both of us started working with Martin Luther King at the age of 19. And we met and began working together in 1964 in Chicago on laying the infrastructure for the Chicago Freedom Movement with Martin Luther King and about 50 or 60 other organizations. Our orientation had always been what we refer to as kind of anti-charismatic, and a turnaround between the paternalistic relationship where we depend on charismatic leadership, strong personalities, versus building respect relationship with people that can be the foundation for the democratic way of life. And so we were very conscious, and as when we were very young, that we wanted to be sure that it was the philosophy and the strategy and the methods of nonviolence that people learned, rather than to give great speeches or emulate great leaders like Martin Luther King. And so in 1964, when we began working together, we were already looking at our work as the next 2 or 3 generations, preparation for the next 2 or 3 generations, so that people would have something more to say than the I have a dream speech type of emulation of Dr. King. In 1971, after Martin Luther King had been assassinated, we spent time rereading all of Dr. King's books and reflecting on our experiences, and we began to see patterns, patterns and strategies, that these campaigns didn't just evolve by osmosis, that there were definite planning processes and definite methodology at work. And we began to codify this, actually with some help from a person in England named Richard Hauser. And those of you who know Nigel Young might find out more about him, but he had been an international practitioner of social movements and cut his teeth against the Nazis in the underground. He was from Austria, he was Jewish, and his wife was a concert pianist, Yehudi Menuhin's sister. And so as early as 1963, there were certain civil rights leaders, among them Bayard Rustin, James Farmer, other national leaders in the United States who were a part of international nonviolent movements, and were bringing strategies and methods and tools for codification of this philosophy to the Kingian movement. Now, there were people in 1971 who wanted to abolish the term nonviolence, and there's going to be some definitional discussion led by Matt and Samuel a little later, so I'm not going to go into that right now. But basically, Lafayette and I decided we're going to redefine what nonviolence is. And so we felt very strongly about the word Kingian, which actually comes from one of the books that Martin Luther King wrote, his second book, Strength to Love, when he wrote kind of a paraphrasing of the Corinthians, a letter to American Christians. And he prefaced it by saying, forgive me if this sounds more Kingian than Paulinian. And so we decided that it was important to have a word that represented the values of nonviolence that was distinct from the many conflicting definitions of what the word peace means. That nonviolence means justice. It means a particular set of values. And so we began to codify our experiences and our work with the Kingian movement into this kind of Kingian nonviolent concept. The second thing about this era, which we referred to as the King era, was that conflict was redefined. Up until that point in the 50s and the early 60s, we had a big subculture of sensitivity training and a whole body of literature that really said conflict is bad and needs to be swept under the rug, and we need to reduce tension, we need to reduce conflict. And of course, Martin Luther King did just the opposite. He heightened tension and used conflict constructively to raise the issue and to bring it to a head where people could formulate what the real conditions were that were holding society back. Also, we recognized that in our experiences that reconciliation was something that was only in tune with nonviolence. It was not in tune with many of the other modalities of dealing with and addressing conflict. And reconciliation, or in other words, winning your opponent over, making an ally out of your opposition, became the goal. And so not only did we learn about the 6 steps and the 6 principles, but we arrived at a new kind of codification of nonviolence that went beyond what the historic peace churches, the Brethren, the Mennonites, and the Quakers had contributed. Just for example, Gandhi credits a fellow in Northern Ireland named Daniel O'Connell, who was a lay Catholic, for the concept of moving categories of public opinion as a third force. And Gandhi claims that he really learned that from this person in the 19th century when he was studying in England. We look at what Tolstoy learned from the Mennonites and the Quakers and how that influenced his thinking and how his writings on nonviolence then affected people like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and a host of leadership in the United States. Or we look at a person named Richard Gregg, who in the 2030s spent time with Gandhi, years of time, and wrote a book called The Power of Nonviolence, and how important that book was for all of us in many generations growing up to learn about the idea, the dangerous idea of nonviolence. We looked at Howard Thurman, who was a great minister and wrote many things that affected Martin Luther King and was a great mentor for Martin Luther King. We look at a person like Miles Horton, who learned from the Danish folk high schools, and a person who, the history of a person named Grundtvig, and started the Highlander Folk School in 1932 in Tennessee to train poor people, white and black, in the idea of the democratic way of life. And they trained 17,500 people in the citizenship education schools. And these people built a platform from which Martin Luther King and other national leadership spoke. So there's a lot of tributaries to this philosophy. And finally, in the late 80s, Bernard Lafayette and I were able to do some work together in the state of New York for 4 or 5 years. And we assembled our curriculum into a more organized booklet of 26 modules that was the structure guide and introduction to Kingian nonviolence, the philosophy and methodology. And now are working with the 3rd and 4th generation of leadership with that curriculum, and seeing people, young people like Matt and Samuel and you folks, developing all kinds of mutations from it that are creative and far-reaching. And so we're still in the embryonic stage of nonviolence, but we've come a long ways from a few simple sketches in 1963 that I learned from Bayard Rustin before the March on Washington. And so I'm happy to be a part of this training and see you beginning another level of this pilgrimage to nonviolence. And I really wish you well, and we'll be following all the activities of the group because I'm still learning too.
So simplified that doesn't need much explanation, but to give an example, might be helpful. For example, in Jos, Nigeria, the city once living together, Christians and Muslims have now been divided based on their communities. Christians live in one community, Muslims live in one community. And each of these communities will say, we're living at peace. We're living in peace with each other. So there's almost an invisible wall that exists between these two communities. So they see that as we're having non-violence, instead of really addressing the issue that can lead to a non-violence way of living together. So that's a Nigerian context. And in the American context, in our city here in Rockford, it is so easy that we could say, okay, the west side can just be quiet and build a wall around the west side, and the east side, it's quiet. There's no integration. We all live in our individual communities peacefully. If we extrapolate this same concept to the South African context, it's like the people lives in the townships in Guguletu or in all the, they should just be there. They shouldn't, nobody should upset the system. Everybody should just be where he should be. And then people living in Constantia should live in their own community. These are two distinct communities that will seek, if you as the non-violence challenge these two communities to integrate. But the pacifist says, just live in your community and we'll have peace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. Yeah. Peter, do you have a comment to add?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on, just trying to put this in a place where you can see it.
But you have a very nice stomach. Just leave it there.
I was just reflecting on our own journey over the last few years as the extremism bubbled up in the town, and particularly a far-right, militant, angry nationalist group emerged. The response to that was often one of equal anger. And we said, we're not going to go there, but nor could we choose the way of total pacifism and just opting out, just leaving it to just go its own way. And over the years, we developed a response which was to actively get out in the community and work in mediation and community mediation during these very difficult times, where we took a very active role, boldly intervening. I mean, some of our people were in the midst of the demonstrations, but being a voice for non-violence, a very positive process in that place. Others were around in the town. And so we have become known for mediating very actively, bringing a very active coming together of people, even in the midst of the violent demonstrations that have been taking place. So this very much reflects how we've been working over the last 6 or 7 years. And several
Beautiful.
have been involved in that.
Beautiful. Other comments from the rest of the group? Thank you, Peter. About this distinction between pacifism and violence, nonviolence or non-violence versus nonviolence. Samuel's story about Nigeria made me think, I'm a part of the Church of the Brethren, which is larger in Nigeria than it is in the United States. And their predominant geographic area is northern Nigeria. So the seminary of the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria is the Theological College of Northern Nigeria. Actually, Chibok, where the girls were kidnapped from, they were attending a school that had been founded by the Church of the Brethren. And so when the kidnappings happened, someone in my church here in Portland, Oregon said, oh, my sister was a teacher at that school for decades. So the connection that I'm making to the story you were telling, Samuel, is that now the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria is doing work in refugee camps where both Muslims and Christians have been displaced by the violence, and working to build positive, proactive community where together they're building a church and together they're building a mosque. And everyone is living there in a community that respects one another, but it's actually in relationship with each other, as opposed to living in separate sectors and saying we're at peace, quote unquote. So someone else, what's a connection that you make, or can you help us further get insight into nonviolence versus non-hyphen violence?
So I have a friend in Tempe who the mosques were going to, the mosque in Tempe was going to be attacked by a right-wing militia, I believe. So if they'd exercised pacifism, you were saying that they would have stayed at home and said, we're not going to get involved in that. Therefore, we'll live in peace. Whereas what they actually did was to activate and surround the mosque in a ring of
Right.
Would that be an action of non-violence, as you see it? Right.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I come out of a pacifist church tradition, so that's a much bigger conversation for me. I know that actually pacifism is not passivism, but I'm speaking about the philosophical position that most people, when they say pacifist, they're talking about staring back from the conflict. So, yes, as an example, personally, I was involved in an organization that's called Christian Peacemaker Teams, which intervenes in violent and low-intensity warfare situations. So as an example, I worked in southern Mexico during the period of the Zapatista rebellion as a nonviolent bodyguard with Christian pacifists who were politically aligned with the Zapatistas but didn't share their violent, their military philosophy. So we were there doing nonviolent action together, going into military bases and praying and planting corn on the parade grounds, and protecting them from the paramilitaries who were still threatening them with death. So that kind of intervention or interpositioning is the work that Christian Peacemaker Teams does. So someone else. Jean, do you have a connection?
I think Samuel basically shared what I would have said, or shared it well. Yeah, because you have those separated communities, and if you live in ignorance of the other community's problem, then you have what we call peace. You know, so.
Okay, thank you. David, will you take it to the next level with some reflection on the democratic way of life and the relationship between nonviolence and the democratic way of life?
Yes. I would just add to the conversation you just had that nonviolence is a synthesis of many things, and it's kind of the social antibiotic which comes out of the tensions and the contrast of truth between violence and pacifism in its popular definition, and that this synthesis is a social antibiotic, and that we are learning how to do that when we're learning nonviolence. The other thing about the democratic way of life is that the principles or propositions of the democratic way of life overlay the Kingian 6 principles that you'll be going into much more detail on. But just to briefly state them, is we are confronted with a paternalistic society, which is based on top-down, one-way relationships. And there's no opportunity in a paternalistic society to have anything other than racism totalitarianism, authoritarianism. It cannot be the foundation for the democratic way of life. And so what nonviolence does is creates a turnaround situation where we establish a respect relationship among people, among ourselves and others working together so that we can share a common purpose. We can compensate to each other for what we're contributing and not contributing, and that respect relationship can be the foundation for the democratic way of life. These propositions, as I mentioned, overlap with the 6 principles. And the first proposition is that we have a type of unity in the democratic way of life that's based on creative use of diversity. That our unity is not based on sameness. Only totalitarianism requires sameness. So we have to understand that our concept of unity in Dr. King's principles, this is called the beloved community. But our concept of unity is creative diversity, and that we bring things to the table differently and bring different aspects to the social change to the table. The second thing is that another proposition is that we work on the partial attainment of ideals, because the idea of people winning together, even our opposition, is that we all have something to gain from the solution of the problem. And therefore, we can't be rigid and absolute in our positions, whether it be making too much commitment to a particular form of action versus keeping in mind the goal. And that the goal is to win over our opposition to become allies. A third proposition, and these are, as I say, are very similar to the 6 Kingian principles, is the relationship between ends and means. You can't use means that are inconsistent with your ends to create the democratic way of life or to create nonviolent social change and change conditions. Another proposition is the idea of consent, that in a democratic way of life, we consent to work together, to govern together, to see government as ourselves, not as some institution over there that's apart from us. That's one of the observations from people in Denmark, or people in the United States, is why are people so anti-government when in democratic societies we are the government, we are the establishment. And so the other proposition in the democratic way of life is the concept of planning. And you'll be talking about this more in this training program when you talk about aggression and conciliation and top-down, bottom-up, etc. But the idea of, in the early Greek term of planning, was kriosis, the idea of creation, of what ought to be. But planning the last 200 or 300 years has come to being something different. It's come to mean, how do I get you to implement my program? And planning is trying to make you fit into my system, which is an anti-democratic idea. And so planning that has a high level of creation of what ought to be, nonviolence releases those kinds of energies in people, and even in our opposition, to find creative solutions to problems. The other thing about the democratic way of life is, and you'll study different types of groups in the community that are key, that are necessary to be a part of the coalition for change, is that we have to have a high level of functional correlation between those working in education, those in religion, those in nonprofit organizations, those who are youth, those who are minorities and women, those who are in government, that when you have these 6 or 7 categories and a high level of functional correlation between them, then you can avoid the pitfalls of some social movements that are single issue oriented and just about me and not about us. And finally, you can't do this work, nor could the movement really develop its capacity without the role of education. That I mentioned the citizenship education schools, 17,500 people at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which was based on the Danish folk high schools in Denmark and Sweden and Norway very early in the 20th century. And that this education was about people learning about the democratic way of life. This is a great story that Miles Horton, who was a good friend, would tell. He said, and Highlander would go out and follow its students who were engaged in social change movements, sometimes unions, sometimes voter registration, and so on. And the whole idea of Highlander was for people to learn how to make their own decisions and not rely on other people to make those decisions for them. And there was a big shooting by the state troopers of some of the people on strike at a textile mill, and the union was very discouraged about what was going to happen because a number of their people were killed. And so they gathered in a hotel lobby and they said, Miles Horton, you got to tell us what to do. And Miles said, I'm not going to tell you what to do because you'll have to make the decision. The guy pulled out a gun and put it to Miles' head and said, Miles, you're going to tell us what to do. And Miles Horton said, and he said later, he didn't know where he got the focus from, but he said, well, you can shoot me, but you're still going to have to make the decision. And the whole place cracked up and laughed. And the point was made that people become free, and their capacity for the democratic way of life comes with making their own decisions and learning from their mistakes. And so when we're in nonviolent practitioner work, there's no absolute. Things are always open for question. And we're always looking for creative solutions and creative ideas because every person has something to contribute to this movement. And I think that the compatibility for Kinging Nonviolence has always been integrated with the democratic way of life idea. And that means that we don't make people more dependent on charismatic figures, but we help people begin to form solid groups that determine their own purpose and determine their own strategies and methods and goals. And that's the way people learn. And those 17,500 people built a platform, as I mentioned earlier, that people like Martin Luther King and other national leadership spoke. And that without that platform, without that base of people who had learned how to function as in a democratic way of life manner, the movement could not have maintained its focus or its discipline or its capacity for planning, its longer range vision and outlook, and its focus on conditions rather than on personalities. So the democratic way of life is a partnership and is a part of nonviolence. Democracy and the democratic way of life can't function without nonviolence, because nonviolence is an ingredient in society that's a life-giving force and a stimulating force and a dynamic force. And it is a part of the idea of the democratic way of life. I would be happy to continue longer on this, but I think that's enough for right now. Maybe Samuel and Matt and others have something to add.
Well, one reflection about what you were saying towards the end about everyone having something to offer, and this distinction between charismatic leadership, like, oh, they're the leader because they can make a good speech, or they're more polished. There's a distinction between charismatic leadership and leadership which elicits all the gifts and visions of the community. And so our responsibility as organizers and nonviolence practitioners comes to be organizing and noticing the gifts within ourselves and within people around us to be able to involve people in something bigger than themselves. And I mean, I think that everyone here is involved in ministry and church life in some way. And so there are parallels to creating new church communities and effective, vital church congregations that that are impossible to ignore. So let's open it up to our group on the ground or our satellite office in Amsterdam and see what you'd like to say about what David just shared.
Before the group goes in, one thing that really stick out that constantly, I have to always put this on the forefront as a nonviolence community organizer, is always remember that one of the key driving forces to realize that my ally or my enemy is my ally. They just don't know it yet. It's turning every opposition, somebody who we consider as an enemy, as an ally, because it's just a matter of education. Education will help them see a bigger picture.
And can I add something to that? Some of my experience, Samuel, has been when I truly engage my so-called enemy or adversary, it provokes me to grow and to change my own understanding. So it's not as simple as I win them to the position that I've been standing in for the last 5 years, but I develop a relationship, and out of that it creates a context where I see reality in a way that includes their reality, so that we can talk about a positive future that includes everyone. It's not just making them fit into my vision. Let's hear one or two comments, and then I think it's time to check where we are in terms of time for our next break.
Comments, thoughts?
It feels it's quite a complex thing, isn't it? Because you need charismatic leadership. You need some degree of leadership or charismatic leadership. You know, we have David here or others to create a vision to take it forward. So you need both that kind of philosophical leadership of, you know, Martin Luther King, who said this is where we should be going, and yet there's also, but it requires bottom up as well to say, how are we? Where are we going? What do we think? What does this look like? So it's kind of a both and thing, isn't it? Because you need someone to have the vision for bottom up. So you know, I'm always struck by that. You can't rely on the charismatic leadership because that's going to get swung in every direction, and people need to be educated and own a vision for themselves. But you need that in order to give us hope that we can do something. So it makes me think quite a lot.
Thank you.
Another comment?
Could you just explain a little bit more by what you mean by education? Because that's a huge term. So, you know, Samuel just said that what people really need is to be educated, but what does that mean? Because that's a huge term. Do they just need to learn? You know, is it they get the philosophy, or do they need to experience? Because that's education as well, right? Or is there a mix of both? What's been your experience in that?
Who wants to take that? I'd be happy to, but who wants to?
Well, it's a concept of learning, not a concept of being taught.
Excellent.
For me, education is based on what do we understand regarding an issue, a condition that is specific, not just sitting down in a classroom and lecturing people, but what are the conditions that we need to be educated, we need to educate ourselves that we want to address, the social condition.
Your social condition is calling, Samuel. What I would add to what my two brothers have shared is that I think that when we say, well, education is important, it's important to say that we're not talking about we're not stumbling into a coded message about class.
Yeah.
So we need educated people to have a movement. No, we need more and more people who can see clearly what's actually happening in the situation that they're in, who collectively are in a process that is pulling their gifts forward and helping them claim their gifts and really their own full humanity. And together we're saying, here are the problems in our community, and here are the solutions we see. And so one of the fundamental things is developing more and more articulate leaders, which who can speak to the problem and speak to the vision, but also the pathway to get from the problem to the positive future that you envision. And when you say articulate leaders, we've got to say in the world that we live in today that there's no one-size-fits-all articulate leader. So I don't speak Black vernacular English in the United States context. There are communities in which I'm near irrelevant, or just say irrelevant, because I'm not articulate in the language and the culture in that community. So when we're developing a beloved community type change initiative, we need to have articulate leaders who are educated, which means prepared to speak to the problems and the potential in many different contexts.
Yeah,
That's good. It's really good.
that's really good. Yeah.
I think one of the things that struck me as David was speaking is the enormous challenge and yet need for what this raises today. In our recent poll over Britain leaving the European community, the Brexit decision, a lot of the decision there was based upon people just reacting against authority. And that is an authority that has increasingly become distant from the people because that democratic deficit is so obvious. I think, to be honest, that would be the way I would sum up so much of what is happening in the huge support at a popular level for Trump in the States. So that democratic deficit that is exposing dysfunction in our society after many, many years of hierarchical systems and so on is so vital that we expose that, but that we respond in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
And to be honest, that's when you bore down into the challenges we've been facing as a town over the last few years, that is really at the core of so much of the challenge. It's expressed itself in a far right street movement. Yet the reality is it's coming out of deep disillusionment with the system.
I think I was thinking as well that the maturity of the leader that you're talking about we desperately need that level of maturity in leaders today. And it's hard to look around and see very many because the system's become dysfunctional to the sense that we're looking for that charismatic leader that'll get us out of this fix. And
Right.
and it'll just be a bigger fix. So I just was really struck by how important what you all are teaching us is in that dynamic, you know, because people feeling heard, feeling valued, feeling, is there a way, is there hope forward, is going to take a lot of listening and maturity on leaders' parts to be able to lead that.
Maturity, which often comes from self-reflection on our own flaws and gifts and callings, so that none of us are better than anyone else. And those of us who are here in the room who've been doing work for 60 years are still learning. And so it's different than a charismatic leader who can have turns of phrase that are very provocative and catalyzing. And we need those people. But to hold that up as the only kind of leader we need people who are summoning forth their full human potential to offer it to the Kairos moment that we're living in.
Definitely, yeah.
Samuel, I would like to check in with you, and Peter and Kathy. Can you give me a time check? Where are we? Time and energy. I just see basically what I've been seeing on the video, but is everyone drooping over there? Is it time for a longer break, or what's happening?
Can we do another 15 minutes or so?
Can we go till 6?
Yeah.
Yeah. You all okay to go to 6? Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah. They're nodding vigorously. Yes, we can go till 6.
Go till 6. And at that time, are we taking a longer break?
And then we do the 30-minute break.
30 minutes. Okay.
Is that good?
Great. Yeah, it's good with me. How are you doing over there, Jean? You're an hour later? 1 hour later? Okay. Good. And David, stay as long as you want. And I know there will be ways for you to contribute, but I also know you're sitting in the public library and it may be time to leave.
Yes, I'm going to have to sign off here for now. Got to get some of these internet problems solved.
Okay.
You know, blessings on your work, and I really appreciate being a part of it this morning, and hope we'll meet again here in this process.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Adios. Samuel, in that case, over to you to move towards types and levels of conflict and the values.
Okay, thank you. I think we will start with the values because oftentimes when we start looking at conflict or we start addressing issues of conflict in our value or in the things that we hold so valuable to us that we don't know. So, and I will be sharing my screen with you. And with that being said, as I share my, let me see, can I share my screen, Matt? Yes.
Yes.
Because, oops. Okay, yeah. So,
Here comes this exercise.
Wow, this is technological.
Did you say?
what I want you to do is, you take 5 minutes. I know there are like 20 questions.
It should be online in your email, Jean. You can probably.
Yeah, I've got it.
Samuel, can you scroll down? Yeah.
There's 22 questions on this value exercise. And what I want you to do is take time, check what you see as a value. And most of this is it's coming from a very American perspective. This is when it may not reflect the entirety of the world outside of the context of the United States. But I think there are some of the values that we can all relate to one way or the other. It might not be expressed in this way, but I want you to put your lenses on you. And what I'll have you do is choose about 5 of those that you think are good for you individually first. And then after that, we will pair up into groups of 3. But first, let me give you a few minutes to go through it. And let me see, 4 minutes. Questions. It's not, this is a group. Oh, yes. It's just, right. What values are most popular and why do you think that is? How did your group decide what top values are? Consensus, group vote, democratic way of life? And were there any top 5 that did not make it to the group values? And how did you feel when that happens? So each group can report back. I'll leave the questions on the screen and you can report back in that light because I guess we don't have so much time left before dinner break.
Do you want me to write them down, Samuel?
Yes.
The values? Okay.
Yes.
Let me work on that. Just a minute. How many groups altogether did you have?
About 3 or 4.
3.
Yeah.
3.
4.
4 plus the online group.
I can't remember. No, 3.
Okay. Okay.
We can go popcorn style.
Okay.
Gentlemen, you want to start first?
We had, you want to know which ones we chose?
What are the most popular values?
The 5 you decided on.
Yes.
For each group.
Each group, for our group, was 14, 11, 18, 17, and 15 were the 5 most popular.
It cut out right at the beginning. Will you say one more time? I'm going to write them down.
14, 11, 18, 17, and 15.
We can see them.
Okay, thanks.
You want to know how we decided?
Yes.
Basically, we looked at who had voted for which ones, and we came to the conclusion that those 5 were ones that we had all 3 of us agreed on, or at least 2 of us agreed on.
Okay.
There were only 3 choices that only made one of each of us. But basically, we were very unified in our approach, and probably the ones that that didn't make it to our top 5 were within our next 2 or 3.
Okay.
So we were very unified in our. It was a consensus, but it was effectively a vote. Well, it was a vote, but it was effectively consensus as well. Were there any top 5 that didn't make it to the group values?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, there were 3, but as I say, they were quite close up there, you know, in the ranking, just behind 5. How did it feel? Well, guys, I was happy. Ian?
I was happy.
We were happy.
Okay, thank you. Next group.
We went through a process of elimination, working out which values we've got in common first, to see if like lots of us have got the same ones or similar ones. And then we were quite diversified in that I don't know everybody very well, but I think we had some people who were married, some people who weren't married, some people with children, without children. So the whole sort of, some of the relational ones were where we had a little bit of negotiating to do. So then we looked at were there broader values where that would encompass those specific values. Because obviously if you're not a parent, then being a good parent is not going to be a very, very high value to you if you've only got to choose 5. So we went through a kind of a negotiating process to look at some of the values that were broader, that could encompass some of the more specific values. And that seemed to work. I was very happy. Were everybody else? Our top 5 were 14, 11, 9, 18, and 13.
Okay. All right. Okay. Third group.
So ours were 8. Oh, sorry. Yeah. 8, which was to have a meaningful love relationship. 9, which was to continue to learn and gain knowledge. 11, to have honest, close relationships. 14, to have a meaningful relationship with a higher order in the universe. And 17, which was to associate with members of other cultures. And yeah, pretty similar. We went around the group. We found that some of them we had the same, exactly the same, or others we had similar. So 2 people said to have a meaningful love relationship, and then another said to have a good marriage. So we went with, yeah, we kind of made them similar and went with the one that the majority kind of voted for. Were there any? I did not make it to you guys.
Yeah.
But
We all had some that didn't make it in, and that was okay.
So yeah.
John, how do you feel?
I feel very good. But yeah, I actually have to go. So I've lost focus in the last 2 minutes. I have a dinner appointment. I'm sorry, guys. I really have to go.
What value are you living out?
So bad. Is that okay if I go?
Yeah.
Okay. See you guys later.
See ya.
Yeah.
Cheers.
John.
Join us again if you can.
So do we have one more group to share, or that's it?
That's it.
Okay. So you see,
1, 2, 3.
the goal of this exercise is to be able to see that even though we live in the same community, we live in the same shared space, we all have the tendency to have different values. If you look across, you'll notice that there are more similarities in most of our values that we share than there is what really divides us. If you look at this 3 14, 3 11s, and the rest is single digits. No, there's 2 9 and 2 18
And 2, 17.
and 2 17. So what that means is we all have different values. But the tendency is that the values that we all come with have a tendency to give birth to conflict or not. And with that, I'll say we'll pause for now and take any closing comment before we take a longer break. And then when we come back, we'll talk about conflict and types of conflict, building on from here.
All right. Thank
Can
you
I
so
add-
much.
Can I add something before we break?
Yes.
Yeah, I just really appreciate that. I'm struck by how many were chosen by more than one group, and I think that one of the things that presses us towards as nonviolence practitioners is that there are underlying values and that we're often pressing towards those underlying values and revealing them or reframing them as we negotiate conflict and navigate conflict in our communities. So, thank you. Can I check with Peter and Kathy? We have one more segment after the break. Is that right? Or are there two more?
Two more segments.
Two more segments.
Two more segments. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
So we will go. Let's try
30 minutes.
Okay, just as I appreciate the sharing, the little exercise that get the energy, the oxygen going back into the brain that allows us to think a little bit differently and to even have a placeholder. The fact about the dedication is it becomes a placeholder for you and for me. As I hear you mention it, I hear Jos, Nigeria mentioned, which I'm from Jos, Nigeria. I grew up in Jos. So, and it brings a memory. And I still work with groups of people that live in Jos. And when I hear being dedicated to people caught up in violence in Luton, and I want to associate that same dedication to my own city, people that are caught up in violence in my own community here locally. So it's, as you share, we glean from it, I learn from it, and I try to picture myself when I hear nuggets from you, reminds me of why we do what we do. So a takeaway from our last session is that all of us have different values. And because all of us have different values, conflict often arises from the different values that we have. And in my work of, as I process this, and in my work of conflict transformation and nonviolence, I've been working on my dissertation, and I'm going to read just a line from a book, The Journey Towards Reconciliation by John Paul Lederach. So, and it's stuck with me because my dissertation is on radical peacemaking for my Doctor of Ministry degree. It says the pathway through conflict towards reconciliation is filled with God encounters. If we have eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to feel. And so as we come this afternoon, there's so many encounters that God puts on our path as nonviolence community organizers. And this path is filled with being able to open our eyes to see what God is doing as we help stir our community towards what God is doing. And being able to hear what God is saying as we help our communities to navigate through the challenging time of what God is saying. And being able to feel with those that are marginalized in society as we seek to address the condition that puts them in that marginalized condition. So that being said, is we're going to look at what, as we process all of these different values and that gives birth to conflict, what are the types of conflict that exist? So in a Kingian nonviolence approach, we'll look at 4 different types of conflict, which I guess you have in your own handout, or I've given you a handout about that.
No, do you want them to have this one?
Here comes this.
Oh.
Is that right?
No.
No, that's but 4 types of conflict. The first one is pathway conflict.
Wait a minute, when you run.
No, he's still tell people.
And in path, I can't hear you, Matt.
If they don't have the handout, do you want me to type on the screen and share my screen?
No, I think I have it. I'll just.
I can do it, Samuel. It's all right. I've copied the page. It's all right. Carry on.
Okay.
And I'm taking notes on the board right here, so.
Okay. Pathway,
Oh, good.
pathway conflict is really, it's an everyday conflict. I go through the same pathway conflict on a personal life. You go through it every day. But pathway conflict is we have the same goal, but we have different method of reaching them. And because we have the same goal, to say, no, my path is the best path. And what end up happening as a result of that is you find yourself in conflict. The second type of conflict is mutually exclusive conflict. We all have different goals, but we choose to function together. For example, I'll give an example of each. Pathway conflict is you want to get to a destination. There are a couple of roads that leads to that same destination, or there's a couple of means of you want to go down to London. You can go to London by car, or you can go to London by train. So the tendency is to have conflict because one person enjoys the scenery of the train, the other person enjoys the fact that they drive and they have the freedom to stop when they want to stop. And that path, just be same goal, but that same path can lead to conflict because we haven't the parties involved have not really seek to understand what is the value behind why they choose this path over the other. So the second one is the mutual exclusive. Different goals, but we choose to function together. And in this case, I always like using a corporation, a company that manufacture printers. I'll use that analogy for the sake of a company that manufactures printers. The marketing department and the production department have totally different goals, but they choose to function together to sell printers. But in nonviolence, as a community, nonviolence community organizing, there are different organizations that are functioning that might be working towards addressing conflict, but addressing issues of change with different goals. But if care is not taken, the tendency is it causes division because you have different goals, but sometimes mutually exclusive conflicts is we will choose to function together even though we have different goals. The third type of conflict is distributive conflict, which is talking about not enough resources for everyone. The simple example that we always have in the briefing manual is a slice of pizza. You have 6 slices of pizza and there are 9 people that are out to get that pizza. The tendency is how do you divide? And we can divide it by redistributing or by redividing those slices of pizza so at least everyone can have at least a taste of it. But it's a competition for resources. And the fourth type of conflict is value conflict. And, we did the value exercises. And what the value exercise tells us is we bring our own perspective into every single situation. And we not only bring our perspective, but we bring the values that we often wear on our sleeves. And so what tends to happen is if we are not willing to look at have a conversation regarding our values, the tendency is we hold on so strongly to our value and we're not open to looking at the other person's value and come to a consensus like we did with our value exercise. And so as a result of that, it leads to conflict. And this conflict can range anywhere from just a regular old normal conflict to pervasive and can go out of control. And what do I mean by normal? You see, in pathway conflict, it is normal to want to go to London and one person going by train while the other going by car. But what happens is it can go from just a normal conflict that we all wrestle with, trying to oh, let's go by train because it gives us the freedom of not having to pay parking fee or not having to stress on the road with all the traffic, or vice versa. If that is not dealt with in a normal, it's a normal conflict. If that is not dealt with, the tendency, it leads to a pervasive conflict, which leads to a tension. Because what end up happening is my ways are the best. We have to go by train, or you have to go by bus, by car. And if that is not resolved, it becomes you go your route, I go my route. And soon we'll find ourselves going way apart from each other. And the tendency in that, the strategy to deal with that is to intervene immediately, or else it will lead to an explosion, which is an overt conflict, which is I'm never going to talk to her, or I'm never going to talk to him. I'm never going to deal with him or her because he or she is refusing to go with my own idea. And as a result of that, we find our ways totally divided. And as a nonviolence community organizer is to look at what point is pathway conflict moving from just a regular, normal conflict to becoming pervasive and eventually becoming out of control. And so in these four major different kinds of conflict, from normal, which is everyday conflict, to pervasive, which becoming a tense atmosphere, to overt, which leads to explosive or physical violence or verbal abuse, to a point where you see at what point does a community move from a normal conflict of feeling a sense of tension, immigrants coming in and taking over our jobs, like we say, like some of the campaign slogan that we hear on this side of the Atlantic, on this side of the pond. And so to feel a sense of we really are angry at immigrants to the point of we want all immigrants banned from our own country. So it can go anywhere from normal, and if not taken care of, it can go all the way to an overt conflict. I'll pause for this moment if there's any question or comment.
Can I add something, Samuel?
Yeah.
So in terms of the normal, pervasive, and overt,
yeah,
one of our fellow Kingian nonviolence trainers, he describes it this way. He says that in normal conflict, which is in all of our lives every day because we're different and we have to work things out with people, there's dialogue. That's people who are actually talking with each other.
Mm-hmm.
In overt conflict, where there's tension in the room and history is there, that there's baggage, you move from monologue or dialogue to monologue, where two people are just speaking at each other, but not communicating as effectively. And the shift then from pervasive to overt, so we go from dialogue to monologue to pick up a log. So that's to say, pick up a log to hit one another with it.
Yeah.
To pick up a log. Yeah, you got me? So, and it's just a short way to remember that you move from dialogue to monologue to pick up a log.
Thank you, Matt. That's brilliant. Is that from Kazu?
Yeah, I learned it from Kazu. Kazu brought it from another trainer whose name I can't remember right now.
So now I got one today. You see,
Yeah.
you're always learning. So, and every community have a tendency to go from dialogue to monologue to picking up a log against each other. And as a non-violence community organizer, at what point do you know you need to almost have your antenna, and I mean your antenna, your God senses of knowing what level is this conflict, at what level is this conflict here? And is it a level to bring in prevention? Is it at the level of intervening, or is it at the level of management? When it's still normal, the first thing you do is you try to prevent it from happening. By the time it becomes pervasive, where there's no monologue, I'm talking to myself, you're talking to yourself, and we're not listening, we're not talking to each other, you need an intervention, you need a mediator to intervene between groups. When it gets to overt, sometimes in overt conflict, you have to create a management system where you separate the people or separate the different groups that are at conflict with each other. And you do that, for example, I am trying to create an example. In Rockford, Illinois, a couple of years back, 2 white police officers shot a black teenager. And if you've watched the news across the Atlantic, it has become one of our norm. It's become really, it's almost becoming like a normal thing here. It's never normal, but it is feeling like it is becoming normal. And so in that case, it has reached the stage of overt, whereby when another incident happens, all you see is wire breaking up. And so in that case, you need management. You cannot prevent, you cannot intervene, you have to manage the situation and bring it back to order. And so, as a nonviolence community organizer, it is to constantly wear the hat of taking the temperature, taking the spiritual senses of where is our community and how can my senses be involved in it? Or how can I be involved in organizing my community to realize what level of conflict can we do? Question, comment?
Doesn't look like it.
Come on, somebody.
It's very good. Very clear. Anybody comment? No.
I'd just say that as street pastors, and that's quite often what we get involved in. If there's a dialogue and voices are raised, we will stand there and usually it will quieten down. But if it's getting a little bit louder, then we'll try and act as mediators. But then if it gets to this pick up a log stage, then somebody needs to come in and manage it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
When the conflict is no longer something that one can intervene for, I don't know the situation in Luton, but I can assume there's a little bit of a tension between the Muslim community and the law enforcement and the right-wing community, those that are nationalists, to use the term, borrow the term from Peter. So the nationalists wants to keep their own country. And we see it on this side of the Atlantic as well. This is not by way of sliding any political party, but Donald Trump is portraying this take back our country. It's getting to that point of almost becoming very overt that he wants whatever it takes to take back our country, will take it. Even though he's not acting that way, but the way it sounds and some of his followers, if you are not with them, you are the enemy. So in that instance, you need a management to deal with that situation. You don't, at this point, you don't need prevention, you don't need intervention, you need to manage those rhetoric in a way that it creates it brings us back to a healthy part of intervention, and not only a healthy part of intervention, but to bring us back to a normal prevention. So you're always, a nonviolence community organizer is always wanting to dial it down to a place that you bring the community talking to one another.
Yeah.
Nancy Pure had a comment, I think.
I was gonna say compassionate now, but it's about kind of the gauge you're talking about and the temperature. Sometimes it's hard to get really what is going on and how far the conflict has gone. But what you're talking about, gauging it and getting the temperature, what degree we are at, in this situation, I think it's very helpful. If something you think it might be small, but it's big for the other party, and it keeps on, kind of compiling that, before there's an explosion. You thought it's a very small thing to you, but because you're not engaging the conflict, with the right, using the right whatever measurements. Yeah.
Just an example from you won't see me. I'm hidden at the side, so that's it. I'm the invisible man. Just an example from when I was working in business, and we did a lot of commercial negotiation, and what it was tended to find was that the real reason, the real underlying desire, want, problem, whatever, was usually camouflaged in other terms. So very rarely, my problem is X. They would always dress it up as something else. I need this, I need that, I need the other. I can't accept this, I can't accept that. And we were always taught when we were doing that is just to try to get right down to the root and try to strip away all those and come, well, what is it? What's really, really at the heart of this? And it's sometimes that can be a protracted process. It can take a while to get to it.
Yeah. And in fact, much of the conflict in our own situation in recent years has been, in some ways, people have tried to define it very much as values conflict. But actually, the reality is, often enough, it is distributive. It's about resources, and it's elevated because people want to see it in cosmic terms. But the reality is that often it's not really.
It's the working poor against the working poor.
Yeah.
But also because of values conflict, in a sense, people can always say, "Oh, that's too difficult to solve."
Yeah.
Whereas resource one means local people need to take action. That can be politically unpopular, so they'd rather make it somebody else's problem sometimes. Yeah.
So, and as we continue in looking at, I think when we move in from basic types of conflict, level of conflict, normal, pervasive to overt, as we take the next, we begin to look at the introduction to the principles of Kingian nonviolence, which we'll keep coming back to all of this that we have said so far, but it's just getting us deeper into the discussion. But as we go into principles and steps, you'll realize that some of the steps will come back to really gauging the temperature again. You never stop gauging the temperature at whatever level in conflict. You're constantly asking the question, the behind the scene question, trying to gather enough information that will help you as a nonviolence community organizer to take stock. Where are we at in addressing this issue? And it's not something that you do once and then you think, oh, I've done it, I'm moving on, but you keep coming back to getting more information, gathering enough information, continuing to educate yourself. Are we dialing this back? Are we addressing the issue? Are we moving in a direction that is non-violence? Or are we stuck? And if we are stuck, how do we unstuck ourselves to continue engaging?
I'm really appreciating hearing the conversation. And the level at which you are engaging the material as a group. And so I'm really enjoying just listening in. One of the things that occurred to me is this word prevention. I wanted to speak to that for a moment at the normal level, because in societies which are conflict negative, you might look at that word and say, we're trying to prevent the conflict. But that's not true. At the normal level, what you're trying to do is interact with the conflict in a way that prevents it from going to a monologue or a pick up a log situation. So you're carrying out the conflict in a way that ensures that it stays at the normal level. So I had an interaction last week. I'm a part of a new work team related to our racial justice work. And there's a woman who's the chair of this steering committee, and I'm the staff person who's responsible for the work. And we're just learning each other's styles. And she wrote and asked me some questions, and I answered them, and she wrote a longer email with questions, and I answered it, but we were doing this all via email, and I started to wonder if there was actually emotional content behind her very structured and formal questions. And so my prevention in the moment was to try to connect on the feeling level by just saying, I can't tell, there's no nonverbals. Is there something else going on that we need to address? Or are these just a lot of factual, formal questions you're asking me? And we were able to check and just stay at the normal level of whose responsibility is this? No, we're just clarifying. But the prevention point was kind of monitoring to see, are we moving towards another level? What do I need to do to keep us actually in dialogue with each other? So I just wanted to share that, like taking it back from the broad social conflict and community, all of these things are also applicable at the human interpersonal level as well.
Thank you, Matt. And so in Luton, how are we continuously engaged with the nationalists, even as we help to get those that doesn't have a voice to, we want to be a voice for them, but we want them to have a voice as well. Kind of like what David meant by said, in a democratic way of life. We don't want to make the decision for them. We want them to be a part of the decision-making process. So how are we engaging a two-way traffic between those that are on the far right or those that are on the far left? And so as a nonviolence community organizer, you are wearing the hat of somebody that needs to constantly engage. There's no, you try to make sure that you're always dialing it down to bring it to, how do we bring it to conversation? Let's still stay in conversation, even if we disagree, but we're still talking to each other.
And so in a way, it's like we're dialing down, but because we're not conflict negative, we're actually conflict positive. We're dialing down the violence.
Yeah.
We're de-escalating violence while we're escalating nonviolence. So just de-escalating violence would be the non-conflict. If you're just de-escalating violence, then that's the non-. But the other side, I mean, what the stories that Peter was referring to this in the earlier session about getting into the conflict in the middle, even in the streets, and escalating the engagement between people, that's definitely not conflict negative. It's pro-conflict, but it's escalating a type of non-violent conflict. And that's where the responsibility that we're taking as practitioners of nonviolence to, on the one hand, bring down the level of violence to a level where we can engage and escalate the level of nonviolence.
Yeah. I mean, initially we found that we needed to listen to the voices of those people on the internet. But then increasingly, we found we were able to engage with the individuals involved, not the key leaders, but with the grassroots, with those who were in that point where they could go either way. Mm-hmm. But increasingly over the years, we found ones and twos amongst those who are leaders becoming open and vulnerable to engagements. And we have seen one or two of those sort of brought back from that position of being leaders to actually becoming engaged in the democratic process. That is very much one of engagement, and listening to the voice. I think one of the early things that hit us was that we realised, this was online, you realised that when you were looking at what people were writing on Facebook, for example, when in the early days of the movement, you were looking at the people involved, and you realised after a while that some of these people were friends of friends on Facebook, because very helpfully, Facebook would tell me who we had friends in common. Mm-hmm. And we found that some of these people were linked into churches, and so we were able to actually identify points of contact with them. And actually that sped the process up, which was brilliant. And then you're beginning to hear the voice and actually engage in that dialogue, not across the gap, but at least bring them into dialogue with us as those who were working for peace in the community.
Great example. Are there other connections that you all would like to make to your own work or your context based on what we've been saying about different types of conflict and different levels of conflict and choosing to intentionally engage them?
I think the interesting question is around who defines what kind of conflict it is. Because
it is an interesting question.
You know, who defines what kind of conflict we're in is quite determinative of what is then done, and is determinative of power. So, and so I think that's, you know, how we even go about deciding, you know, who it is that decides what kind of conflict it is and who has the right to decide that. Becomes quite a bottom-up thing as well as a top-down one. Because top-down one will say, really wants to keep the status quo. And so if we pick a subject, we want to keep the status quo, so therefore we define it as a problem of ethnicity, and it's your problem of ethnicity. And actually part of what we're doing as churches together is saying actually there needs to be a voice for the disempowered white voice, because no one is giving that a voice, and actually it can go to the far right because it's seen as a value conflict, and the far right plays as a value conflict, but we're saying that it's much more than that. It's about the distribution of education, the distribution of power, and the distribution of money. And so even as the churches together, I've not been part of that, but actually saying, how do we give those folks a voice which doesn't come out through far right? And the far right will then define it as a value conflict and therefore turn it to their end. And so that's part of the conversation that's been going on the last 6 months, is how do we give voice without, while we're keeping it away from that value manipulation, which we see.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, for sharing that, because some of what you've just said, we will cover it tomorrow in Principle 3, Aggression and Conciliation, community organized. Am I correct, Matt? We will cover some of that, the spectrum of allies. Top down, bottom up.
Yeah, that's tomorrow, a little bit later tomorrow.
Yeah, a little bit later tomorrow, and as a result of that, we will, in that process, as we do talk about top down and bottom up, you will see where something that will come up will be spectrum of allies.
Yeah. Can I add something that's not on the curriculum, Samuel?
Yes. I've just added.
You don't have to pay extra.
This is actually some of the material that's in the Kingian. Like, what we're offering you today and tomorrow is really like a briefing. There are different levels of engaging the material, and it's very common to have a 2-day introduction that's like 2 full days. So we're giving you as a little less than the 2 full day because there's not as much opportunity to go into some of the material. But there's a lot of material that also doesn't even get taught in the 2-day. And so this is one of those things. I was thinking, I couldn't see who was speaking about who has the power, but that really resonated with me.
Mike.
Mike, yeah, thank you, Mike. That really resonated with me because in some regards, as nonviolence practitioners, we're choosing to build the power to be able to frame it for our community. And sometimes by framing it in a captivating way, that shifts the situation. So even if technically the council government has the right to say what's going on, you as the community group has a right. So here's one of those like ways of, this is a diagram that's in the larger Kingian Nonviolence Manual, and that talks about conflicts between the majority and the minority. That says in any situation, where there's a majority and a minority, there are different points of intervention. And so and here I'm representing there's a fence or a barrier between the majority and the minority. One point of intervention is within the majority group, because the majority group itself has its own conflicts and issues that it needs to deal with. Another point is within the minority groups themselves, because they have their own identity development and processes that they're in the midst of. Another is looking at the wall between them and saying, well, let's knock down this wall in that way. Let's remove that plank from the wall. Let's take these bricks out of the wall and try and build common cause between them. But oftentimes, like even if you knock down part of the wall, if you haven't done the work within the majority group, there's not going to be a willingness to build common cause here or enough understanding. So there's intervention here, and then on the fence itself. But then there's the larger framing of what is the conflict really all about, which is an additional, like, what is really going on here? Is it ethnicity? Is it distributive? Is it, like, do we accept that this is a religious and values conflict, or do we not? So, like, this is the point where I think when you were saying, Mike, who has the power to do it, it's like framing the whole thing. But even if you frame the whole thing, you still got to work on these three other points. So I wonder what you think about, like, all of you, or Samuel, what do you think about what I shared?
I think it really is a great summary of what normally does happen. Is if one of those things is out of order, something will unravel.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah, and so I think, like in a United States context, we can, where I'm working on racial justice and mostly trying to help white people connect with the Black Lives Matter movement or make sense of what's happening here in our country related to Black and brown people asserting their right to be fully human. I mean, I think that's the process that we're still working out here. Even if we change policies about how police use force here in the middle, if white folks don't have the support to transform to another way of thinking and identifying themselves, the fence is just going to get built in a different way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so while many of us who are activists and change makers see the fence very clearly and want to jump in and tear the fence down, if we don't have parallel processes within the minority group, not we majority people going and doing something to the minority group, but we're working with our allies on that side who are working in their own community. If these processes aren't happening, you don't actually succeed in tearing the fence down.
Yeah, and I think what I completely concur with that, because I think what the interesting thing, we had a hinge moment in what we've done in Luton, which is when Rohanna really came on board, because you've got lots of people in there actually in terms of Christian-Muslim relationships. You've got Peter and Kathy, lots of other people actually quite positive towards doing work with the Muslim community, but it's only when you had what we call a person of peace, someone who'd really worked with us within the minority community, that actually things are beginning to really step ahead, because we've got people in place 1 and in place 2 are able to talk to the people who control number 3, and then that starts to change the whole thing.
Yeah.
So and you only get 1, 2, 3, and 4 when you've got a movement. And I think that's when I look at what was being talked about earlier about the training of tens of thousands of people that had capacity, and I think I recognise that in a very small way, that actually we've got 1 and 2 and 3, and in the overall narrative of Britain First, who we're dealing with, being banned from Luton last week, which is our far-right group, that changes the narrative of legality, which is almost 4, because we've got the movement that were coming in causing us trouble that we've met with, being banned from coming in. So 4 is that illegality around the whole thing. So I think I completely can see that.
Can I ask a question of you, Matt?
Coming to the picture.
Can you see that? Hi, sorry, I'm
Stop hiding, man.
I'll do that. I'm hiding behind Mike's PC. There you go. It's goodness me.
Wow.
Yeah. How do you deal with the victim mentality in conflict, particularly when there are people who have the vested interest in trying to perpetuate a victim mentality? We've seen many instances of that, but how do you work to to turn that into a power mentality, particularly in the minorities? Can you talk to that maybe for us?
Well, I'll try to say something, but other people will have wisdom on this too. I think the first point is that there are always people within those communities who are working for the empowerment of themselves, and they don't need us to go do that. Like, I'm thinking as a white man, I'm applying your question to the context that I'm living in. But it's actually, it would be a process of gathering information about who's working for empowerment within those communities and how can I support them, not how do I intervene in that myself. So that's one thought. I think that the framework that we're working with and what we're trying to offer in these couple of days related to nonviolence as a process, David was saying it is an ingredient, a life-giving force, and a stimulant. And I think that part of what nonviolence calls forth from us and being involved in nonviolent processes is our own inherent dignity. And so there's a difference between saying don't be a victim and just involving someone in an empowerment process. Like, all of us have healing to do. Like, there's no one who doesn't have healing to do as a human. And so in the process, some of us need to let go of some of our overinflated sense of ourselves. And other people need to step forward and inhabit roles of internal authority even more. So I think that being involved in these kinds of change processes, if they're built with that DNA, can actually help all of us heal. And so yeah, what do you think? Or someone else take a step.
So would you say, Matt, sorry, just to clarify what you said, this is very helpful, by the way, is that part of the non-violence involves maybe helping, give people power to change the situation or to address the situation. Yeah. Would you say that's part of the process?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe the slight tweak I would offer is recognize the power that they already have.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I think just to add to the question there, and in some ways speak to some aspects of it, one of the things we face in a culture where only a minority of the people of Luton are quote unquote white English. Right. We are what is sociologists call a super diverse community. And one of the things about a super diverse community is that there is no single majority. Everybody is a minority. Everybody has the psychology and sense of victimhood of is traditionally felt by a minority.
That's good.
Part of the conflict that we've experienced in the last 7 or 8 years has been over that actually you've got 2 groups posing themselves as the victims of, or in fact 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 groups, when you start to break it down, posing themselves as the victims of the culture. And everybody has their hurts. Everybody has a sense of injustice. Everybody has a story that backs that up. And actually, the intervention in that is extremely complex.
Yes.
I think in some ways the process, to some extent, one's had to ignore those who are reveling in their hurts and actually just get on beginning to build the strength of those who are willing to move beyond their hurts and their sense of victimhood. And now I think we are in a stage, I mean, Mike's referred to several legal decisions just in the last weeks that give us a bit of breathing space. And one of the things we've got to do now is to look inward to some of our own communities. With the pressure of the campaigning movements on the outside removed for a season, we now need to work on strengthening our own communities and looking at them and saying, how do we deal with some of those hurts, some of those injustices, some of those tensions that prevent the long-term solution. We can't rely upon the law to separate us, to keep them out forever, because that would be to test the structures of democratic society and freedoms within it. But we need to actually begin to try and strengthen our own community to deal with the tensions that are inherently there within our within our very complex demographics at the moment.
But, just thinking that this diagram up here about looking at the inside of each group, not assuming that everybody that would be in the English side would agree with the government. In fact, it's probably a narrative that we need to very quickly be able to counter in good ways that help them see this isn't a political decision.
And also, the interesting thing with that picture is that, as you redraw, we don't have much MHA. We have 6 and so to explain the context, you've got the Afro-Caribbean community who are very frustrated with the various different ethnicities that they associate with Islam, and they've got shifted out, and the Irish community before that, and then the traditional English community, and then you've got all the Eastern European communities coming in, and they all have their own. And then you've got
the Hindus and the Sikhs of them.
And then you've got kind of skin color associated, because we've talked about ethnicity, but also skin color. So therefore, coming in around death in custody, and so actually and so then it is a really interesting one where we're a mosaic of. Not massive. I mean, there's 133 languages, 200,000 people, 133 languages. But actually, so that's the interesting thing is actually, when you start framing it, one of the big framing things is everyone is a victim. And so the big, one of the things that we've noticed in the past 2 years probably is that language of how can you take victimhood out to say actually everyone is a minority, but we haven't quite used that language, I don't think. But we're all minorities, so none of us have.
Yeah, I'll make one more comment, and I think we're going to move towards the principles here. This is a really rich conversation, but so there's one approach to victimhood, which is saying these are not scholarly terms. This is just me participating in the conversation, which is saying. We're not really victims, we're just minorities, or saying you need to get over it, or saying, and I wonder if from the dialectical kind of thinking that we were experimenting with before, saying, what's the thread of truth in that? Yeah. And maybe the intervention is, even if this doesn't, I mean, surely there are psychological pathologies that someone is stuck in a victim identity and they need to go to see their analyst. I mean, they need to go see their therapist, like we all do. I think everybody needs therapy. That's just my perspective. But as a change effort, what if you validate the thread of truth that's within that victim claim? No one watched out for us when the automobile factory closed down.
Right.
Who was taking care of us? No one was taking care of us. And yes, we've been here for 1,000 years. But as the community is moving on, we're disoriented. And what if you speak the truth of that as far as you understand it? Or what if of those 133 language groups, your change effort seeks to understand the truth? If they all feel like victims, what's the heart of the truth there for each of them? And bring that into your work as opposed to diminishing it, but looking for the thread of truth that's within it. So,
yeah. Try to help even the communities that feel they are minority. What is the underlying condition behind what they are, what they feel, or what they perceived? It's their reality. So being able to find the underlying condition from each of these different segments of society, of communities, might help them begin to see, actually, this is the condition that we are facing, and will help the whole community now as a nonviolence organizer to frame one issue to address. You, as a nonviolence community organizer, you might not be able to address every single condition, but when you start addressing one condition, it has a domino effect on all the other conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah, so I want to check about time. I am just in the conversation and would like you to give me a time check. How long until the next break, and then the final session is how long? Just let's all stay on the same page.
Well, we're ending at 9. We could have a, need a 5-minute stretch.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes right now, and then go
That's
to
good.
yeah.
That's good. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's just break for 5 minutes. If you want pizza, which you
Yeah, I'll put a piece of paper here.
That's right. No, it's
Samuel, let me call you.
just,
Okay.
That was actually looking else. We did we had a guy, we did political theology. Just, it was just, it was just interesting to see the differences and similarities.
That's interesting. Because if we're
It's quite big
minority
agreement.
groups, then we must have.
That's where obviously there's quite progress.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the commercial control. That's of course you have to get on. Yeah.
So if you actually knock
But
down
that's quite
half
important
one
because
wall,
it's
that
engaged from.
There are lines within
This guy was talking
when the walls come down to create new lines. So
Steve Wagner.
that's right.
So how do you identify all of the minorities? And how do you ensure you're working with minorities?
Well, the thing is, the nature of super diversity is even within one minority. I mean, if you don't remember, Muslim communities, I talk about different generations. So you've got your incoming generation, then you've got your second generation, and the third generation. There's different psychology and issues related to all.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of even the one, what I would call the 1.5 generation, which are the ones who came in below 5 for schooling.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
And then those who are second or third generation, they just married an income.
But then you've also got the female.
Yeah, that's right.
And the,
Yeah. So you've got huge
There's
complexity.
200,000
Yeah.
minorities.
And the most important one is, and then within the black community, you've got the Afro-Caribbeans, and you've got the Africans. They are,
Somebody else told me.
I mean, very simply put, the psychology of slavery 200 years ago, 200 years ago, in mind. and the idea that actually the ones who failed in Africa are the ones who solved it. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's very simple, but actually there's a tension there. Very different.
Because you have got then so many huge different groups.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
And that's
and that, I'd love to, because obviously the principles and all things are applying the same way, but that's a huge
within the Muslim
part.
community, you've got exactly the same splits as you have within the Christian community.
I mean,
I know.
We're all
And that's the
sitting by
same.
grace.
There's 200,000 minorities in the most important one is me.
We get that right, yeah. Thank you, Lou. Yeah, right.
All right, we have our list here.
Is that everybody? Right. So everybody else is not. Okay. I will check that when everybody comes in.
They do know what they're talking about, don't they?
They're really
Oh,
good.
yeah.
Really good.
We've got to find some whiz bangs. What if all your assumptions are incorrect?
You've been watching too much BFG.
EFG.
Big friend of John.
And
You don't want to do
Yeah.
No.
Thinking about this.
Looking good.
Right.
It helps just to take that little stand up right, doesn't it?
So did you do the trainers course for this?
Yeah.
The trainers for this day?
We did the 2-day module. Then we did 3 days of more in-depth stuff around it.
Yeah.
And then the second week was on doing actually training again.
And that was that 18 months, was that while I've been here since I've been here?
Yeah, it's 2 years ago I did it. I think you were off duty.
I was off duty but aware.
Yes. Yeah, I did Chunky before I went away.
Teacher, they're being paid for this.
Yes,
Presumably.
they are.
Wow, Samuel, you're putting on your coat.
Yeah, I'm in the basement and a reaction.
No, he's smartening up for the British. Put your tie on, Samuel, please.
Yeah, I'm putting on my police stuff.
Oh, look, guys, he's got this is his police badge. His police champion badge.
Oh, yeah.
Peter, I can mail one to you.
I'm not.
I can mail one. Just
Do you have the pads of arrest?
no, we have what we call citizens arrest.
Yeah.
Okay, are we ready to start?
We're ready to start. Yeah, we are. We are.
Okay, so we've been speaking a little bit more practically, and we're going to take a step back towards the philosophy. And so for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be introducing the 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence, and if time permits, just very briefly, the 6 steps. And this will set you up. There's a reading assignment between now and tomorrow, which is Dr. King's essay, The Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. Peter either has in hand or is prepared to email you. Yeah. So
They're getting it on paper now as well.
say again. I missed that. Okay.
Then we've got it on paper.
Yeah, good. So the principles are really the moral, the philosophical skeleton on which everything else hangs. And I think that one of the things that you may start to see is that you can use a similar tactic, like I'm going to go talk to my opponent, whether you have these philosophies or not. And what I mean, but the difference is the quality and the value that you carry with you when you're making a press release or when you're holding a community meeting. And so this is the core DNA of the Kingian nonviolence framework. And so, and we hold them so central in our approach that we really, I mean, I don't know anyone who's tattooed them on their skin, but we memorize the principles so that we're able to refer to them in conversation. Like, oh, this is a good example of principle 4. Or like, well, there's, principle 6, the universe is on the side of justice. So as we introduce them now, and then as you read about them in King's words overnight, I invite you to let them impact you. And I think that you'll recognize some of the theological roots. You'll definitely get those in King's writing directly. The definitions that I'm presenting today are from the Kingian nonviolence curriculum, which is a universalized approach. So it comes out of Christian agape love theology, but also the larger heritage of nonviolence. That's a broader, longer philosophy and experiment in the human experience. And so, but I think that you'll be able to make connections immediately to scripture, to faith commitments that we have as Christians who are committed to justice and peace. And so as we go through, I will ask you for some of those connections. And so I'm going to try and share my screen where I have a PowerPoint now. Let's see if this works. Wait, do you see a PowerPoint screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. Let me see if I can make those larger, because you're probably seeing the whole PowerPoint interface right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me try this. Okay, how's that? Is that different?
Good.
Okay, good. So here's a picture of David, who was with us this morning, and Bernard Lafayette, who are the co-authors of the curriculum. Peter probably got to know Doc, as Bernard did in your training program. Do you want to make any comment about Doc?
They're inspiring. I was just interested to hear David this morning or this afternoon, and to actually see the tremendous differences, but it reflects their heritage. They bring into it, but the commonality. And so it's actually very interesting doing this training now. I think it will enrich my ability to communicate it.
Beautiful. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. King said to Dr. Lafayette the afternoon that he was killed that the next steps in the development of nonviolence were to internationalize and institutionalize nonviolence so that it was woven into the very fabric of our communities and our society. And so that's the work that we're still carrying out today. And so here we are with principle 1. And I'm actually, when we read the principles, I'm going to actually ask you to stand up and to read them aloud together. And so read principle 1, and then you can all sit down again. So stand up. Let's all stand up. Samuel, you too. Let's go. Let's go. Vigorously, vigorously, as if the very powers could hear us. So here we go. Principle 1.
Non-violence is the way of life
for courageous people. Okay, you can sit down. You need to do that again? What happened? Okay, one more time. Come on now. Okay. Here we go. All together. Non-violence for courageous life for courageous people. All right, and you can sit down. So nonviolence is a positive force confronting the forces of injustice and utilizing the righteous indignation and the spiritual, emotional, and intellectual capabilities of people as the vital force for change and reconciliation. What stands out to you? What words or phrases stand out to you reading this principle?
Positive force.
Yeah, exactly.
Confronting.
Mm-hmm.
No violence.
Righteous indignation.
Yes.
I like that.
We're not repressing our righteous indignation to be only calm, quiet people who speak of peace in hushed tones, but we're harnessing our righteous indignation in the service of a larger goal. I think that one thing about this being for courageous people, number one, that runs counter to the idea that if you're against violence, you're a coward.
Yeah.
Number two, you don't have to be courageous already to choose it, but we find our courage in the collective context of working for nonviolent social change. So it's pointing towards the kind of people it makes us into. And it doesn't say this is only a place for courageous people.
Yeah.
I'm actually struck by the way that it talked about the forces of injustice, and it depersonalizes the target or the object, really.
Yes.
Anticipating another stage.
Yes, that's right. Just wait for principle 3. Let's move on to 2 for now.
Okay. Ready, set?
Okay, stand up. Let's go.
It's a bit emboldened.
Okay. Principle 2, all together. The beloved community is the framework for the future. All right. The nonviolent concept is an overall effort to achieve a reconciled world by raising the level of relationships among people to a height where justice prevails and persons attain their full human potential. What stands out to you here?
Beloved is a very Christian term, isn't it? In England, you only hear that in the church.
I didn't hear the beginning. Did you say it's not a very usual term?
Yeah, the beloved is quite a Christian term for us. So you don't hear that in the church in this country.
Mm-hmm.
The church is the beloved, the dearly beloved brethren is a classic.
Yeah. It also seems to be aiming towards the Jewish and the Christian version of shalom, which is the reconciled world. It's not the absence of a conflict. It's the presence of reconciliation.
Yes.
Also, in this one, full human potential is seen in the context of relationships, not the zone of proximal development of your own ability. Because normally it's about your own ability and yourself rather than relationships.
No, that's
Yes.
good. That's very good.
Do you all have this on paper too?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to not be totally invisible. So I just come back to talk to you in between them. But you can keep looking at your handouts if you want to keep bringing this in. So what difference does it make if the beloved community is the framework for the future? I hear you that it's in the context, it's a bit of an archaic term, beloved, or an unusual term. The history of this term is that it was really developed within the context of an organization that's in the United States but has an international parallel, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, in the beginning of the 1900s, and began to be used there within that Fellowship of Reconciliation to describe the goal of peacemaking and reconciliation work. But it was really popularized in the United States civil rights movement because it was picked up as a way both to describe the community of struggle and the goal. And so this is one of those places where, as a Christian, like, I can't help but see the parallels, because for me, the goal are communities where everyone feels fully beloved. And that's whether someone comes to be Christian or develop that particular faith commitment or view, the idea that everyone is beloved in God's sight, that everyone is precious and has inherent dignity, that's the community that I want to work for. I want to claim my own belovedness and not just the ways that I think I'm great because I'm white and male. And I want other people to experience their own belovedness too. So what difference does it make if the beloved community is the framework for the future? I'll have you apply it in this context. Think of a conflict that you're currently involved in. It could be in your community, but it could be something very personal or interpersonal. If you held the principle that the beloved community is the framework of the future, if you brought that to a fore, even if it was already within you in some way, what difference would it make in how you thought or felt or acted in that conflict? And so right now, I'm not going to ask you to tell the details of the conflict, but I'd just like to hear from a couple of people, maybe people we haven't heard from recently. What difference would it make in that conflict if you were trying to hew closely to this principle? How would you act, think, or feel?
I think it would mean that leaving the community or opting out or quitting or giving up would not be an option.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The community is paramount.
Yeah. Someone else?
I think that this will make me commit to the process of reconciliation or something to kind of resolve whatever is going on.
One of the things for me is it means that I have to remind myself that even the people that I dislike or detest are beloved, and that I'm trying to work for a future relationship in which we're together. And sometimes because of mistakes that I've made in conflicts, there are things that I need to actually remember my own belovedness and seek forgiveness or forgive myself again in order for me to be ready to move into beloved community. Because I don't know about you, but I've made mistakes that I held against myself for years that were a smudge or a strike against me that prevented me from being confident and joyful and loving in returning to a relationship or a group setting. And so the beloved community is a challenge to us both as we think about other people, but also as we think about ourselves and the future that we're trying to build. Are there any other comments about what stands out to you here, or what difference it makes to apply this?
I think it just makes you more caring, more enthusiastic. There seems to be more of a heartfelt need for it to work.
I thought of it in the context too, when you put up the frame of a house, the frame is what you hang everything else on when you build it that way in America. So I just thought it made me sense of the solidness of what you've already got. Even though you may not see it, it's there, and it'll continue to be built on.
Kathy, that's really interesting because I really appreciate that visual metaphor, because it means that everything that you do, while you might be clear and bold in naming the injustice or the condition, you're always trying to build a house that eventually everyone will be able to live in, which is not the way that a lot of activists tend to operate, which is vilifying, identifying the one who should be excluded, the one who is fundamentally evil. And it's not about not naming evil, but it's creating a situation where, unless you believe in political assassination, you're envisioning a future when everyone is going to be there.
I think one of the things that's just happened for us is that one of the founders of the group that we've been struggling with here, the uncle of the main leader, recently has, over the past 2 or 3 years, has moved totally away and is now working for peace in the community. And he said to me the other day, we spent 2.5 hours talking. He said it was the way you were working that meant you were not against anybody.
Yeah.
It meant that you listened to us, you reached out to us, you heard us, but you also doing that with others. That is what enabled us to trust you in the end.
Wow.
So it's taking these principles, which I didn't consciously work with at that time, but of course I was working with the sort of scriptural foundations
Right.
and underlying these things. It was doing that and building our own path that meant we weren't against anybody, but we were for everybody. It meant it helped him find a way out.
Yeah, Matt, the other, I'm just thinking of a little bit of a theological perspective on this as well, just briefly, was that, I think we have to believe that what we do on this earth matters and is carried forward into, into eternity, it's an eschatology issue. And, I think when we have the view that, one day God's going to come back, wipe everything we've done out, and he's just going to impose something brand new, then that means, in a sense, what we do here doesn't matter. But if we believe actually that what we're doing here, is going to be carried on, which I think is the right and the correct view, then this belovedness is part of an expression of the kingdom of God, whether, as you say, they choose ultimately to become Christians or not.
Thank you. Let's go to number 3. Everybody up? Principle 3, all together now. Attack
forces of evil, not persons who do evil.
All right. The nonviolent approach helps one analyze the fundamental conditions, policies, and practices of the conflict rather than reacting to one's opponents or their personalities. Talk to me about this. As I said, we were already prefiguring it in an earlier conversation. What stands out to you here? We're really getting into the discipline of nonviolence, the discipline of being a practitioner of nonviolence that presses us to think and act and behave in different ways. And this is one aspect of that. What stands out here for you, or what provokes you?
I think as a social scientist, it just takes me into home territory. Do you know what I mean? You've got to do your analysis, rather than simply attack the people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But don't you love attacking people? I mean,
Yes.
it feels so good.
Yeah. It's a lot more fun.
It's a lot more fun. It's a lot more fun, and it's a lot less satisfying. And what I mean is, like, when I think in the U.S. context, under 8 years of George W. Bush, how, which you can have your own parallels to this, how many conversations I was in with people who thought he was stupid or made fun of him, or it's like we spent so much time ridiculing our political opponent rather than strategizing for how to confront the forces that he was representing or the policies that he was carrying out. And if it's like, it can be a catharsis to vilify the opponent. And so we all sit around and have a drink and complain. And if all the energy, and complaining is actually good to a certain extent. But if we had spent those 8 years developing a vital political opposition, I wonder how the world, like even just those conversations, well, what are the forces he's representing? What are the weak points in those policies? What is the way to develop a vital opposition movement? I wonder how our country would be different today.
Yeah.
And I think there's another level actually, and that was his genius. That actually he played that part as well. And so actually that was, and so that's like part of Trump's strategy actually.
Right.
You divert everybody because he's an affable, everyone thought he was an affable fool.
Right.
But actually doing many things behind the scenes.
Right. Right.
It was even one step beyond what you're saying. It's actually his strategy. So actually, there is quite a lot of that where if you spend all your time hitting forward to the dictator rather than sideways, you're always going to lose.
Right.
I think the biblical principle behind this is one of the hardest ones to grasp, I think, for most of us. Because you don't want to do it. You know that your battle is not against flesh and blood. Well, yeah, but.
Right. But the interesting thing about that, because it's not just come out of my theology degree, so sorry for the, that's it. But just that word, but our struggles against the powers and principalities, that word, arche, which is a Greek word for power, literally is the whole, is the political movement, the power movement.
Yes.
So it's not about people themselves, but it's the power movement, that basically opposes people and keeps people down and all that. So,
And how wise you get this.
That's it.
I mean, and this is where we can study what the true meaning of Ephesians 6 is in terms of what is God's armor, what is truth that we buckle around our waist, or integrity for a breastplate, or shoes that equip us to proclaim the gospel of peace, the shield of faith. It's like, this is what it points us towards. We're going to say more about this principle tomorrow. There's more to unpack with this, but today we're just trying to introduce each principle to create an opening for you to read the pilgrimage tonight. Do you want to make any comments before we move, Samuel? I'll unmute you. No. Okay, you're good? Okay, here we go.
Yes.
I think this takes a lot of healed or empowered, or do you know what I mean? This takes a certain inner power to do this. Mm-hmm. It's easy for us in this situation where we're not in a place of conflict at this particular moment. But in the essence of conflict, this is an enormous switch movement to do when under the deepest pressure.
Yes.
And when it's personal.
Yeah.
When you're in the middle of a personal conflict, rather than, but I find it much easier in the geopolitical realm to do that. That's a lot easier, or a far right wing. But when it's a personal issue, that's a whole different issue. A whole different application.
Okay, here we go. Principle 4. Everybody get ready. Okay. Okay, now you remember that principle 4 has 4 parts. It's a long one, but there's 4 parts, and that's how you remember it. So, and they are, I'll just tell you really quick, so then I'll break it down, and then we'll say it together. So, accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. So, everyone all together now, principle 4, accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. All right, you may be seated. Excuse my church coming out. In the Kingian curriculum, we say that self-chosen suffering is redemptive and helps the movement grow in a spiritual as well as a humanitarian dimension. The moral authority of voluntary suffering for a goal communicates the concern to one's own friends and community as well as to the opponent. This is one that a lot of people challenge. And so I just acknowledge this as we go into talking about it. I'd just like to hear what's on your mind. Accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. Who'd like to speak?
We're all looking down. Who's thinking?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like, I mean, I completely get it, and yeah, I also think of people like Bonhoeffer, you know, and so that's a completely different approach.
Of being what?
Well, he didn't. He retaliated in the sense of he tried to assassinate Hitler. So he, you know, so within Bonhoeffer, that movement that's part of our tradition in that sense of resistance. He chose a different way. He accepted the suffering, and he wasn't really retaliating, but I would say trying to assassinate Hitler was pretty strong. You know, and I'm just thinking about that. You know, that's what comes to.
Sure. Thanks.
I accept it for myself, but in people I respect, they took a different path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Someone else.
I think when you're right in the middle of it, you have to be very, very self-disciplined to put the theory into practice.
Yeah. So I'll make a couple comments about this one. So, you know, the classic kinds of examples from the Indian independence movement or from the US civil rights movement are the marchers, the satyagrahi, as Gandhi's peace soldiers were called, marching on the salt works and being beaten and taken aside, and the next row steps forward to be beaten and they're taken aside, and it just goes on and on and on. Or the picture of children being sprayed with incredibly forceful fire hoses from the US civil rights movement, or even in the Montgomery bus boycott, which was really the first outright campaign of the civil rights movement, that women and men walked for more than a year instead of ride the buses. And I think that there are several things that happen here. One is that the commitment is revealed, that the fortitude that the movement has and its internal power is revealed. One is that the oppression or the situation is made plain. So in living out principle 4, we don't do anything that prevents others from seeing what's really happening here. Whereas if you say, I mean, and I'm just arguing the philosophical point, but if you say, I just got hit by somebody from the neo-Nazi group, I'm going to hit them back. When they show the footage on the evening news, they see a couple of people fighting instead of someone who just got punched in the face, who's there from the Christian base community and continues to stand there and say, I love you, brother. So it makes it completely plain what's happening. I have a couple other like illustrations that put it in a different context. I think that one way to think about this is in another light, is that we're choosing to change our lives and pay the cost in the service of the cause to achieve the goal. And that means that sometimes it is suffering for our families or for our preferences or for our other commitments when we dedicate ourselves to our change efforts. I think it is a dividing line between people who talk about the problems and people who are willing to work on the problems to say, I'm willing to pay a cost for this issue. Yeah. The last example that I want to give is from a totally different situation. Samuel and I have a co-trainer named Kazu Haga, who is part of an organization in Oakland, California called the East Point Peace Academy, meant to contrast with the U.S. military's West Point Academy. And he says that Principle 4 should be carved in the stone above every gymnasium. That's to say, every athletic center should have this here, because he says that athletes know this well. Mm-hmm. That athletes pay the price of the suffering of training and pain in order to achieve the cause, in order to win the goal. And that's a parallel for us in nonviolent social change, being willing to accept the suffering of being reshaped, of being as who we are as people, and what our priorities are and how we spend our time, and our willingness to be attacked without defense. So what do you think? Principle 4, talk to me a little bit here.
Sounds great on paper.
Yeah.
I think it requires an enormous level of discipline, and I think what's really interesting was when West came into town bringing white crosses aggressively into the Muslim community. One thing that the community did was produce sheets for the shops, which was don't respond to this aggression with aggression because you're being videoed. And so this was a really interesting one because they fundamentally understood this, that actually the aggression was deliberately being done in order to elicit a response which would immediately get put on YouTube or Facebook. And I mean, I can't remember, it's some extraordinary number of hits that these things would get. Over a million, you'd get over a million hits in 25 million. But that's the level that you're getting. So actually, there was an immediate turnaround within that. You know, the immediate turnaround was to produce things that were put in all of the shops where these guys were going to come in again, and to go, you know, fundamentally accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of, you know, us not being back on social media again. And I think they understood this. And okay, that was a very short-term thing, you know, and one thing, but I think, and actually they got the respect of lots of us for that. And it was really quite powerful.
I thought the example of sports is such a good illustration, because I've just, all the hours of listening to the Olympics, but yesterday especially, they were again and again saying, you know, how the Olympics, it does radiate with our lives. But here we do have a group of national flags from every part of the world, people living in peace, struggling and sacrificing to win the goal. And in a lot of ways, it is creating that environment in which we can do these things. That is what we want in our civil lives as well, not just in the sporting arena. But the sports really does help us think through the self-sacrifice, the toil. I mean, it takes a lot of work to get to that level. So It's something to challenge ourselves with.
I think I can say again also that, you know, one of the things that came up in the conversation with this man who has completely changed over the past years is he said, I looked at you and others who were working for this, and I asked myself, what were they getting from this? And I saw they were getting nothing. And I asked myself, what were they willing to pay? And he said, I saw you being challenged by myself aggressively, but not responding. And I was and whilst I didn't respond at the time, later on, as I look back at that, I realized how much morally superior you were and what you stood for was to what I was doing.
Wow. Wow.
That is the fruit of doing this.
Yeah.
I mean, it was actually, it was very gratifying to listen, because this has gradually been coming out over the last year and a half. But just 2 weeks ago, he sat down with me for about 2.5 hours and just talked out more of the story. And to hear this, you know, as I say, it just points back and shows how this journey has been so worth it.
I want to make one more comment. Thank you. That story that you're sharing in pieces is really a powerful one, and I really appreciate how it's bringing it home. I want to share one more thought about Principle 4, and then we'll move on. And we're going to work with these in different ways in tomorrow's session. But it's really important that Principle 4 doesn't end halfway through. And what I mean is, halfway through, it would be accept suffering without retaliation. And I don't know about you, but in some of the churches that I'm in, there's a kind of a martyr complex that's like, oh yeah, well, I'm working hard, like, and I think it really matters as a corrective that this is not, we're going out to seek martyrdom, period. It is, we are accepting suffering that we have counted the cost. And without retaliation, we are working for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. They all matter. Like, the two halves matter in particular of this Principle 4. So, Samuel, do you have a comment before we move to 5?
I think, well, I like the fact that you put the you rested on martyrdom, because sometimes we see it as, I'm just a martyr, instead of really the goal is to achieve, the essence of the suffering is to achieve the goal. And the goal points back to the beloved community again. Yeah.
Okay, everybody up. I'm going to get this back on the screen. We're going to share number 5. Share screen. Here we go. 5. Here we go. Principle 5, avoid violence of the spirit, as well as external physical violence. Okay? So it's that we don't just avoid hurting people, but we avoid hating people, or we strive not just to quit hurting, but we also strive to quit hating. Sometimes that, I think that this one is also a challenge to those of us who struggle with self-hatred and self-recrimination. The things that we can see so clearly that we've done wrong, because that itself is can be a form of violence that diminishes our own ability to shine in the world. living out principle 5, we avoid that internal violence towards ourselves as well as towards others, in addition to avoiding external physical violence. Someone talk to me about this one. Let's hear who's around the corner. I can see the same people. Yeah, there we go. Let's look her over there. Yeah. Peter, yeah. Okay.
It's Ian that keeps disappearing, but Let's see. This is just Nancy, but I really.
Nancy,
Well, there might not be something else to say.
Well, it's just one of those things which is as a Christian, it's one of those. It's the fundamental, one of the fundamental commands of Christ. It's the, it's one of those almost, there's no comments about it because there can be no comments about it. It's bedrock. It's fundamental, really. So hard to do, but it's fundamental.
And I was thinking with the end goal is a beloved community. And so whether my heart likes it or not, we've got to keep moving away from the hating internally to making room for that other person, or the ideology or whatever it is that needs to be reconciled.
Yeah.
And it's just like Annie just said, it's just part of the process that one has to get into your heart and head that this is the way we do life, and keep wrestling with it.
This is one of the ones that really demands and propels us towards spiritual and personal maturity.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of us, it might be easy to say that I'm not going to hit my opponent. But grappling with the feelings of resentment and disgust and dislike, to make it words that are more approachable than hate. I think a lot of us struggle with those feelings. And this is pressing us towards attaining who God would desire us to be, which is, it grows us up to try and live this one out.
I was reading in the material Dr. King's letter from prison, and I did a bit of research about it. His influence and some of his theological influences. The theologian Paul Tillich and people, and saying that one of his big things was, the whole thing about learning the principle of agape or agape love, which is that that love of Christ's love of desiring the greater good for the other person, as opposed to just having feeling the sentiment or whatever. And I think, as you say, it's actually very difficult to have that agape love at the same time as being bitter towards someone, even if you don't hit them. Basically, it's that thing, isn't it? So.
And here we go to number 6. Everybody back up.
Yeah.
Okay, principle 6 all together now. The universe
is on the side of justice.
Truth is universal, and human society and each human being is oriented to the just sense of order in the universe. The fundamental values in all the world's religions include the concept that the moral art of the universe bends toward justice. Oops.
Yeah.
For the nonviolent practitioner, nonviolence introduces a new moral context in which nonviolence is both the means and the end. Samuel, do you have a reflection to offer on the universe being on the side of justice?
Because we live in an ever-changing world, my offer for this is not always something, it's kind of more a hopeful thing. Whenever we read this, I'm reminded of Hebrews 11. where Scripture gives us heroes in the hall of faith, where all of these people, even though they did not attain, they didn't see the result happen. Some of them did not see the result happen in the fruition of their work happen in their own time, but somehow they are listed amongst those that have worked hard. And so when I look at the context of our own world, when you work for justice, you might as a person not see the result in your lifetime. Because I think of people like Cesar Chavez. I think of people like Nelson Mandela. I think of people like even Gandhi, having to stand and to face the empire and confront empire. They might not see the result in their lifetime, but it always comes back.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my own personal reflection. So in my own context, I try to contextualize it. I might not see the instant result of what I'm laboring for, but the universe is always on the side of justice because justice often always prevails.
Thank you, Samuel. Does anyone else want to add a word about this one?
Yeah, it's just quite an interesting question. Non-violence is supposed to mean to the ends, but it feels to me like non-violence is being used almost like a metaphor here, rather than in the strict definition that you're using. So earlier you defined non-violence as a systematic framework of both conceptual principles and pragmatic strategies to reduce violence, promote positive peace in the personal community. It's quite an enormous thing. Do you see what I mean? That's one of the things I picked out that definition. And so it seems to me that even that term non-violence is being used in a kind of metaphorical way rather than it's defined quite strictly in one place, but it's being used as an overarching term in another. Because you can't have a strategy as an end and a pragmatic strategy isn't an end. Do you see what I mean? So I agree with it, but I'm trying to work out what it means. Really.
Well, what it means is non-violence includes both the philosophy and the methodology. So I see where you're wrestling with it, but if we say it's both the way that we work. So I guess it would be possible to say the beloved community is the framework of the future, which means I'm going to need to love you someday, but I don't need to right now. But we say, because it's the means and the end, nonviolent, that the beloved community is the framework for the future, and that reaches backwards from the future to mean that the way I'm going to treat you right now is going to move us towards that outcome. So,
I think I completely agree with it, but I think what I'm trying to say is my whole background comes from truth in the end is quite beautiful. And I'm always looking for a kind of more beautiful way to express what non-violence is than the way it's been, do you know what I mean, than the way it's defined. So I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah, no.
But as a social scientist, things can become quite endless and non-beautiful, and you kind of go, how can it? Do you know what I mean? There's almost a flowering that's needed to. Because I agree with it completely, but I'm just trying to struggle with how I can say it simply to someone else. If my wife says, well, what is non-violence?
So what do you say?
By non-violence in a simple way to someone.
That's good. That's a good place to be as we get towards the end of our first day together. I mean, because the truth is that there's the definitions and there's the philosophy that we can read, but we're all called to account in different contexts and different communities. And so we can talk about how we succinctly define it, and maybe we'll do that tomorrow. But that answer is going to be one that is in each of our own language, because ultimately we own it for ourselves and interpret it to the communities we need to interpret it to. So we can share in the definitions together, but the practice, like what you're saying, is how do I explain it to my wife? How do I explain it to the shopkeeper? How do I explain it to this person when I'm on the street? Each one of us is going to have to find our own language. So I think that we're at the end of the principles and about to move towards our closing activity. Samuel, am I right?
Yes, I wanted us to check with Peter and Kathy. How are we doing on energy here and time?
We're doing well on time. How is the energy?
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. Mob it up well, finish it well.
Okay.
Yeah,
We'll be back tomorrow with more excitement.
exactly.
So then let's go into our final activity for the night.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
So we're going to go back to principle 1 for the next 20 minutes or so. And then we'll have just about 5 minutes of procedural kind of comments. But what I'm going to ask you to do, principle 1 is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And all of us in the circle, all of us here, have stories from our own lives about either interrupting violence or situations we've seen where someone courageously interrupted a situation of violence. And that could be in a broader systemic way, or it could be in a moment of high conflict. What Samuel and I would like to invite you into for the next a little bit more than 15 minutes is a time of sharing stories. We're not going to try and have one story from each person, but we would like to hear from several people. And these are stories of courage in your own life about interrupting violence. Either courage that you've witnessed, or if you choose to be so open, a story where you summoned up courage to intervene in a situation of violence. And so I think I'll leave it at that and open the floor. And we will hear these stories with a sense of reverence, and there may be silence between one story and the next, and then another person will speak. And we'll end it when it gets to be about 15 minutes so that we have 5 minutes at the end. So I know not everyone will get to speak. So let's go ahead and move into this time of sharing.
Who wants to start us off? I'll tell a really short story. I don't know what gave my father the courage to do this, because it wasn't something I saw him do on a regular basis. But he did have a sense of wanting to see people helped. And we were coming down the road, and I don't know, he took notice of a pickup that was pulled over on the side of the road. And as we got a little closer, he said later he noticed from afar that it looked like a man was beating somebody. And we were out just on a country lane driving somewhere, and he stopped the car, and he said, it was 2 of us in the car with him, he said, lock the door and don't get out of the car. I think it was Scott and I. Anyway, he went to the back of the pickup, and the man was beating his child. And he just stood there and talked to him for a while. And the man's hands stopped going up and down. So I just remember him suddenly stopping and then turning around and getting out of the pickup with the child. And they shook hands, and Dad came back to the car. And didn't really say much except, I couldn't let that pass. But it really stayed with me from a man that didn't talk a lot. It's something we're called to stop and do something. Yeah.
I remember my mother, who I was about 8, 9, I was learning to swim, and it was at the public swimming pool, and there was almost no one left swimming, but there was still all the people who'd been watching. There was about 25, 30, 40 people there. And one of the male help, the lifeguards, stole the swimming top of one of the others and was humiliating her. And my mum, who was never seen it, say boots to the goose really, went right out from the audience thing, straight out, confronted the male, this really big male lifeguard, and gave the woman the top. And the interesting thing was, she took him on and she shamed him, and it was quite a public humiliation actually. And I was 8 or 9, and I still remember that. There's something, but that's one thing where I respect her, and B, there was a real humiliation going on, and she just stepped into it. And it wasn't, she was nothing bad was going to happen, but it still gave me a framework.
So shared earlier a little bit of my background and how I came to kind of start looking into this subject. I remember this time during school I was leading a discipleship school in Nigeria, and some of the conflicts, during that DTS. There was this guy who, they were physically fighting in the classroom, after a lecture break and stuff. And it was really violent. They were, hitting each other with chairs and, all sort of things, really. It was really horrible. And so we tried to manage the situation, calm them down, we kind of sat down to discuss what was going on, why this violence and stuff. And one of the guys that was really hurt, he got really angry and left the classroom and the discussion. And so we were waiting for him because we can't carry on without him. He's one of the big party in the conflict. So we were waiting, and we didn't see him. So I had to go out to look for him. I went out looking for him, and he was behind the building somewhere. And he was, I was there at the right time. He was trying to insert something in his jacket. So I went, and he was angry, really, really angry, and I was nervous at the same time what this guy could do. He won't have any respect for me if he's too angry as a leader. So, but I, kind of put myself together and, have this courageous face and looked at him and asked him, what is he hiding in his jacket? And then he doesn't even want to look at my face. He just want to move on, and I stood in front of him and asked him what he's trying to insert. And I then saw a little bit of what was in his jacket. It was a machete. That he went and he took it. He was gonna take it back into the classroom to hurt the guy that he was fighting with. So I was like, what to say to this guy right now? And he showed me what he was carrying, and I was like, well, we've seen a lot of conflict, in northern Nigeria, and I asked him, so if he's doing this because of a mild argument, that he had, and disagreement, there is every possibility that a family member could be hurt, because there was this huge conflict, that was going on. So I asked him, what would you do if your mom was to be hurt or was to be killed, in the midst of the conflict that was going on? And he stood there, and then, he thought for a while, and then broke into tears, started crying and sobbing, like a child. And quite a tall guy, very huge. And then they took him back to the classroom and said, let's go back in. And he just shared a huge testimony and was crying and was very apologetic and repented for his actions and what he intended doing with that machete. And yeah, that was it. But he didn't graduate at the end of the day. He had to do a DTS again.
You saved someone. You saved someone who made a big difference to someone's life.
I had a very violent incident in a classroom once. I was teaching class of 4 and 5-year-olds, and one of them had very particular learning needs, and you had to be very careful how you talk to him, because all sorts of triggers would send him off with sort of irrational behaviour. And just before lunch one day, somebody said something to him and he became really violent and started throwing chairs and turning over tables, and we had to evacuate the other children outside into the playground. I just had this memory of him picking up the milk cartons, you know, that they all have individually, and throwing them one after the other on the top of the interactive whiteboard, which costs thousands. And I'm just watching this milk dripping down the interactive whiteboard. And you couldn't go near him, you couldn't approach him. Obviously by then, one of the other staff got some of the senior management in. We just spent ages talking him down, just talking, until he just sat on the floor and cried like a baby and just wanted to be held. But it was a very memorable moment.
I mentioned that I was in an organization called Christian Peacemaker Teams, and the last time that I was in the field with Christian Peacemaker Teams is actually 15 years ago. It was around the time of September of 2001. And we had just accompanied this community, had been living in refugee camps for 4 or 5 years, and they were getting tired of living in refugee camps and wanted to move back into their communities of origin because they were running out of firewood and didn't have access to their gardens and were living on beans and rice from the Red Cross. And so our team walked with them while they were returning from the refugee camps to their original communities. And part of that dynamic was that it had been their neighbors who kicked them out at gunpoint 4 and 5 years before. In addition to paramilitary forces that had been living, that were resourced by the Mexican army and connected to the large landowners in the area. But so we're there and we're living in a tent, like my teammate Keith and I, next to the home that had just been reoccupied by one of these families. after it had stood empty for years. And the tensions were very high. And the moment I want to share about was a moment of clarity, because rumors started to go around the village that the paramilitaries were going to come that night to attack the people who had returned. And there were two other people who were with us who were from a human rights organization that were kind of like, it was kind of like human rights tourism. Like they'd come to Mexico, they'd gone through a brief training, and now they were there in a tent, and they didn't have much else supporting them. Now when the rumors went around about the paramilitaries, they immediately started packing their bags, because they said, we're here to be observers. We're not here to risk ourselves. And Keith and I started talking about what we would do if the paramilitaries came. And we ended up walking patrol all night that night in the coffee groves, prepared to intervene physically, to interposition ourselves if someone came to try and attack that family. But the clarity that I had was when I went through training with Christian peacemaker teams, we literally wrote our own funerals. And is the clarity that in that moment when an attack was coming, I had already given up my life. I had already made that decision.
I think that reflects for me the fact that when one sets out on a path, that actually the next stage is always very normal, non-dramatic. It's the logical consequence of what you've done. And you don't really feel a hero.
Right.
At the same time, it's just the next step.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, I mean, I've been in some of those moments, not as dramatic. Well, no, actually, I have. I have, yes. But it never seems like that. It's,
right.
It's the normal thing. It's the thing you do because you do what you do. And yeah, there is a freedom in it.
Yeah.
Having chosen that way.
Right.
I think I say that, and I say that in paying tribute to, you know, I look back over 7 years of doing what we've been doing here in Luton, and I think probably, I estimate there have been about 80 people involved, probably, in various actions to prevent violence. And every one of those is a hero. Every one of those would probably say, well, it was so obvious what I had to do at that time.
Yeah.
And they'd done it because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think the same would be true of, you know, I look at Jane and what street pastors do, you know, the situations you face sometimes going out, you know, are quite frightening. And you are ordinary people, but actually you do it because you do it. That's why you're there. That's why God put you there. You believe you're there for the reason, and you do it. And so there is something there that is very freeing in choosing this path.
My burden is heavy, but my yoke is light.
Yeah.
Okay, friends, we're wrapping up. We're just in our last couple of minutes. what we've done today was get started, provide some of the historical context, ask you to reflect on your context and describe it in a succinct way. We practiced conflict analysis, pathways and types and levels of conflict. And now we've been exploring the principles, and we got a little bonus about majority and minority conflict and framing conflicts. So there are 2 assignments overnight. One is, or before we meet tomorrow, one is to read The Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, which Peter and Kathy are distributing. The other one is to share with at least one other person outside of this group what's happening here and what it means to you. This is a little bit of the practice that Mike was pressing towards. What's going on here? What is moving you? Why does it matter? So share with at least one other person. And Samuel, I know Samuel's on his way to pick up a daughter at school, but can you give us, here, let me unmute you there. Can you give us a closing word?
Yes, the closing word for me is I look forward to what is going to unravel in the next day, and not just ending after the workshop, but down the road through the corridors of history that lies ahead, and the opportunities that we can continue to work on this together.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Peter, I know Samuel has to leave, but if you want to chat for just a minute about anything we need to make arrangements for tomorrow, I'm happy to.
I think we're pretty okay. Just we'll see you. I'll probably come online 2:45 tomorrow. Ready, just so we're ready to roll.
The same time tomorrow. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Great. Sounds good.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
so much. Enjoy your day.